Non-government business item 1, Misuse of Drugs Amendment Bill. I give the call to the Honourable Sophia Mormont.
Thank you, President. I would like to speak in support of the motion. To lead the continuation of the debate on this bill, I would like to remind the House of the context. Currently, police can use Schedule 7 or Schedule 8 of the Misuse of Drugs Act when assessing whether a cannabis grower is to be accused of drug trafficking. Schedule 7 refers to a weight of 3 kilograms and Schedule 8 refers to 20 plants. Now, the police gets to choose which schedule they wish to use. So it doesn't matter the size of the plants as such. So there's 20 seedlings there, then they can choose to set that up as for trafficking. And the 3 kilograms can also include the soil that is still stuck to the roots, so it's not actual plant material. Now, anything over those limits may be deemed a trafficable quantity by the police. Now, currently, if the Director of Public Prosecutions insists on asking for a drug trafficker declaration, the court has no option other than to hand down such a declaration, regardless of the circumstances. No judicial discretion exists concerning a drug trafficker declaration. Rather, the court is obliged, under a law passed in a previous parliament, to do so, even if it is plain to the judge that no trafficking has taken place. A review of the Criminal Property Confiscation Act, led by the Honourable Wayne Martin, recommended that the courts be given the discretion to decline to declare a person to be a drug trafficker if satisfied on the balance of probabilities that the person has not engaged in the trafficking. The motion put forward by the Honourable Brian Walker was that the Misuse of Drugs Act be amended to reflect the recommendation, which is recommendation 9 of the Martins Review. I strongly support the motion due to the fact that there is a lot of evidence to suggest that there are many trafficker convictions dispensed by the court to people who are growing but not trafficking cannabis. Now, in regards to the growing of cannabis and the amounts of plants that people may have been found with, we are looking at people who are growing cannabis for their own use, whether that be recreational, that can be one component, but often it is people who are treating their own cancer. A lovely lady from Mount Barker was caught with plants and processing equipment, and she is definitely not a trafficker. All she did was grow the plants to manage her own cancer diagnosis, and she has lived way past her use-by date. Now, based on the current practice of police, it appears that anything over those limits will be deemed a trafficable offence, so the 3 kilos with the soil attached to the roots, as well as having over 20 seedlings, which might be very low weight. Second, it seems that the current practice of the police is to measure the weight of the plants in such a way as to increase their weight. So, like I said, with the soil attached to it, and if you've just watered your plants, that also includes the weight of the water as well. Thirdly, judges have openly stated that they have, due to this clause, convicted people of being drug traffickers when they did not believe that they were. So, one case in particular, Patton and Annor versus the State of Western Australia, a case that was before District Court Judge McCann in 2013. This case led to Judge McCann to say openly in court that he was being asked to make an unjust finding and that there was no justice in our current system with regard to confiscation. Legal experts such as Malcolm McTusker QC and Tom Percy QC also tell us that these injustices occur on a regular basis. A person should not be classified as a drug trafficker and should not have their assets confiscated unless they can actually be shown to have been trafficking. Another example of that, for instance, might be in the seizure of assets where a drug dealer lives in a particular house, possibly with his family, or a grower living with his family, gets busted for a certain amount of cannabis, right? And that whole family may lose their house, and that could include mum and the children. And that is a fairly common family arrangement, by the way. For this reason, I support this minor amendment to the Act. The bill before us, the Misuse of Drugs Amendment Bill 2021, would put a stop to the situation whereby, in circumstances where the controlled contraband material is over a certain weight volume, judges are forced to make a drug trafficker declaration, although there is no evidence of commerciality. This would be through one simple amendment, inserting a subsection that would allow a judge to decline to issue a drug trafficker declaration when satisfied that doing so would be unjust. So when we look at judges and their job, and no doubt it's not a very easy job at all, their job is to enact justice. They need to be provided the tools to do so, and if a law is unfair towards either the person that has been caught with the material or the people that are living in a home or family that might be living in a house, then that might not be an entirely fair judgment of this judge to give. Now, these are highly qualified people, and I feel that we should be able to trust their judgment in enacting justice as it is meant to be enacted. The submissions to and the conclusions of the Martin Review show that our judges and lawyers recommend this. The whole point of this justice system is to enact the justice. Many more issues within the current Act need to be amended, but this is one simple option that could be easily addressed to make the law a lot fairer. Now, I do have a case study, a specific case study as well. In 2016, Kenneth Williams was paying off a house he had bought 21 years previously. He was growing 5 plants to make cannabis butter to manage side effects from medication he was taking to treat hepatitis C. It was the only thing he found that helped with his nausea and loss of appetite, among other symptoms. He also had 8 small cuttings to pay back the grower who lent him the growing equipment. He had admitted to police that he had grown cannabis in his shed, which led him to be convicted of cultivation of a prohibited plant with intent to sell or supply. His house was frozen for 6 years and then ultimately confiscated by the Department of Public Prosecutions. Now, Mr. Williams lived on the pension. He had $6 a week and had only $30,000 in super. His house was his super, but then he lost it due to an outdated law. So I don't think that was particularly fair. And do I believe that people who traffic drugs or sell drugs illegally should be punished under the law? Absolutely. Okay. So when you look at those who are growing cannabis for their own use, cancer patients and chronic pain patients are the most obvious ones or the most common ones that do this, and in particular for cancer patients, they need to grow quite a bit to treat their cancer. Now, I know that cancer is treating cancer with cannabis is not particularly mainstream as yet, but we are seeing a lot more research coming out with that. We have a lot of anecdotal examples of people treating themselves and having some really good results with that. The other thing that you see is that a family living with a grower or a dealer that may be in a domestic violence situation, and that family may not have any say over whether plants are being grown on the property or whether any dealing should take place or not. And that family requires protection as well, and they certainly shouldn't lose their house simply because someone in their household is participating in illegal activities. Thank you.
Members, the question is the bill be read a second time. The Honourable Lorna Harper.
Thank you, President. I today rise to speak on this bill, as you might understand, would not be agreeing. I was listening very carefully to what the Honourable Sophia Marmont was saying, and it is very, disheartening when you hear stories about people who have cancer and have been accessing cannabis to ease their symptoms. But then I kind of wonder, like, 20 plants? 20 plants is a significant amount. It's not the biggest amount in the world, but 20 plants, irrespective of which stage they may be at, but 20 plants is a significant amount. You'd need quite a bit of space to grow 20 plants. You'd need quite a bit of water. If you've got a hydroponic system set up, you would need quite an extensive system set up. That is why currently the law is the way it is, because they were looking at when they brought synthetic cannabinoids in and then they brought hydroponics in, the law changed to meet those needs. And one thing I do know is that the Legalised Cannabis Party talks about cannabis as though it is a soft drug, as though it is it's a cure-all. And I have to say that before I was on the select committee into industrial hemp and medicinal cannabis, I was one of those people that thought, oh, what's the problem? But then I went on the select committee and I learned so much more. And now I am firmly opposed to us thinking that cannabis is the be-all and end-all and everything. Now, that's my personal opinion. It did change because I gained a lot more knowledge. And the knowledge gained being on that committee, it amazed me, some of the things. We travelled to Queensland to go to a symposium and people going on about the benefits of medicinal cannabis. But what I found there were people trying to sell the vape system. It looked like a bong. It was a vape system, so you could actually take your medicinal cannabis. There was all sorts of things being sold there. There was people there rallying against, laws throughout all of Australia. But I didn't actually learn anything new from that symposium. In fact, I was actually very disappointed. Now, that may have been the fact I had just come out of having COVID, and I did have to watch some of it from my room. I was not infectious at the time. I had tested negative several times. But I found it very difficult to feel anything that came out of that symposium. I think the biggest news I got that weekend, I believe, Labour won the federal election. I think that was the weekend. Yes, it was. And we won the federal election, and there was resounding victories here in WA. And I was with my colleagues, the Honourable Jackie Jarvis and the Honourable Matt Swinburne, as we celebrated, much to the Honourable Matthew Swinburne's horror, having stuck in a room with the Honourable Jackie Jarvis and I, because apparently we're not very quiet. But yeah, so we were very disappointed at the symposium. I was more interested on when we went on our trips down to the southwest. We met with hemp growers. We met with the companies that were actually growing medicinal cannabis. And I was very, very, very impressed. I was very, very impressed with what I saw with the growing in the medicinal cannabis. I was very impressed on the setup and the quality frameworks, the medical conditions and the sterile conditions and how the cannabis was growing. The smell, I have to tell you, was extremely overpowering. It was something, it made my eyes water. And no, we couldn't get high from the smell. We were masked up, gowned up. In fact, we looked like Oompa Loompas from Charlie and the Chocolate Factory because we were all gowned up, glasses, masks, gloves, booties, the works. So we were really, really, really going in and we were looking. And what they were talking about there was the purity of what they were growing. The purity of the cannabis they were growing for medicinal use. And that was brilliant. And that was one of the things that changed my mind. Another thing that changed my mind is when the committee took a trip and we went overseas. Now, it's in the report. We visited Prague. And before I went, I was told, oh, cannabis, it's available in vending machines in Prague. No, it's not. What they call hemp or cannabis is hemp. It's food. You can buy chocolate bars. In fact, we did buy, I think they were like coconut ruffs. And we're like, what? And then we sat there, and before we ate them, we did read the ingredients just to make sure that we weren't going to do something illegal. And we read it, and it was chocolate with hemp. The illusion that cannabis is available all across the world and it's easy to get quality is really, really a misnomer. People in Prague were openly smoking, not so much as people in Germany when we went there, when we went to Berlin and we went to Frankfurt, and we met with people high up in the government there, and the way talked about it, and they talked about the issues they had with people and illegally growing cannabis. Now, there is a huge difference between somebody illegally growing cannabis, 2 or 3 plants in their house for personal use, than to somebody growing and having 3 kilograms, 20 plants, etc., etc., etc. There is a difference. And I understand the thought that you might be sad around somebody potentially losing their house, etc., etc. But then I ask the question, and maybe this is just me, but if I was in that situation and I had a partner and they were doing this, or I was the person, let's say I'm the person that's got a little hydroponic thing out in my garage. By the way, I don't, but I had it set up and I was growing it. I think other people in the house would realise. And if I was that person, I would also look at what the risk and the rewards are. What risk is it of me doing this versus the rewards? Could I lose my family's home? Or could I make lots of money? So the risk and the reward, it's there. It's very clear for people to see what the risk is and what the rewards are. It is very clear. So if I was that person, my family would be horrified that I may or may not be gambling with their life in their house. And another thing that I don't think the Honourable Sophia Mamon really highlighted, the fact that the prosecutor can make an application for a drug trafficking declaration. The prosecutor, generally the DPP, so it's the prosecutor. So it's not the police officer that came in and, you know, as we know, the police come in, they make the arrest, they provide the evidence, and the prosecutor is the person that then makes the decision as to what the charges are going to be laid. So I think it's unfair to say that the police are the ones making these decisions. It may be a police prosecutor, but it's a prosecutor. But I digress from what I was thinking about on our trip through to the continent, you think I was still in Scotland, through to Europe, and then from there we went on to, horrible to say, that we actually went on to Israel. Now, it's just over a year ago that we were in Israel, and it was a lot more fascinating on the industry when it comes to medicinal cannabis. The fact that you could go into a chemist and behind the counter there was all these remedies for everything. In fact, at one of the warehouses we were at, because there was a lot of men explaining things to us, in one of the warehouses, one of the gentlemen kept holding up this packet, which was pink. And I asked him, well, what's that for? And he said, it's for women's stuff. And I says, well, I'm a woman and I've got a lot of stuff, so you need to be more precise. And I had to ask him quite a few times because I knew what he meant, but it was amusing me the fact that he could not actually, alliterate the words. It's for menopausal symptoms, or it's for women menstruating. And then I asked how they applied this, and it was a suppository because it was actually to help with pain for women when they were having their period. But the man couldn't say that. It amused me to no end because it was me, but it just said a lot about what was happening. They also took us again to their highly regulated growing areas, highly regulated. We had our shoes cleaned on a regular basis, going in and out. We were, again, dressed like Oompa Loompas. The reason you knew it was me was because I was the shortest person in the photographs. We were taken around warehouses, probably 5 times the size of this chamber, that were full of cannabis plants in all different sizes, parts of production. We got to see up close and personal the oils coming off the cannabis plants. We got to smell them. We didn't touch them, taste them, or do anything because that would have contaminated them. And we know through all that, there in Israel, there was a huge problem with people using illegal cannabis. I'm not going to say marijuana because, as Dr. Brian Walker's already said in the past, that marijuana is more of a name to make it sound terrible. We're talking cannabis here. But we're also talking about the misuse of drugs, and cannabis is only one drug. We have other drugs. So, you know, we do have... what if we changed the words cannabis and we changed it to methamphetamine? Then we've got a whole different conversation going on there, a whole different aspect. People no longer think it's a soft and fluffy drug. People start to think that it's very serious. We think, now I don't know the difference between ice and crack. Nobody's ever explained it to me, and I don't want to Google it. It's not my thing. But we know that there is a scourge of people that are addicted to methamphetamines, ice, crack, whatever you call it. And I have unfortunately met somebody who was on crack, and I was horrified, absolutely horrified as to what was happening to them. So then what if we then change the thought of the fluffy, it's not so bad, cannabis, and we start talking about cocaine? Heroin. Coming from Scotland, I remember I lived in Edinburgh in the 80s. Now, quite a few of you here would have either read Irvine Welsh's book Trainspotting or watched the film Trainspotting. And I have to tell you, that was the cleaned up version of what it was like in Edinburgh in the 80s. Because in the 80s, Edinburgh was the heroin capital of Europe. I personally remember being in a nightclub. We'll say it's a nightclub, but it was some dodgy place down the back in the old city. And the bouncer knew us because my friend's brother was a bouncer and they knew us. And they came and got us out because the police and the ambulance were coming because a girl had OD'd on a table in the middle of the club. That's how bad it was. She didn't OD on cannabis, she OD'd on heroin. But again, let's choose everything that you're saying about cannabis and put it towards heroin or cocaine. We know cocaine's rife. It's in the, apparently, when they test the water and the sewage system, you come up with all these things. Now, I've never seen cocaine. I've never met anybody who's, well, I might have met them, I wouldn't know, but I've never actually watched anybody have anything to do with cocaine. Maybe it's because I'm working class from the west coast of Scotland and we were all too poor. But yeah, no, cocaine to us was a rich person's drug, something that we didn't see. But then we could also look at cannabis and we'll change that to synthetic cannabis. Now, we all know what happened when synthetic cannabis came in WA, and I believe there was some young people took it and unfortunately lost their lives. So we have to be very careful when we're saying the misuse of drugs and when we talk about cannabis and, you know, we try and pull the heartstrings and we say, oh, somebody with cancer. Now, I feel for those people and I do understand that anecdotally that it can help with nausea, pain, things like that, and that's great. But we have medicinal cannabis for that. Yes, are there barriers? There are some, we're working through them, but we do have medicinal cannabis for that. I understand that people might want to grow some plants. You know, my opinion is not the official opinion of when it comes to what's going to come out, but I know my opinion on 2 or 3 plants. You know, my opinion. But 20 plants or 3 kilograms is something I would have to actually have a lot more thought about. But again, listening to the Honourable Sophia Marmont, we are meant to believe that anybody that has went through with the 20 kilograms or the 20 plants, or the 3 kilograms, automatically is classed as a drug trafficker. And again, that isn't true. It has to be applied for by the prosecutor. And that is the way the law currently stands. And I think it's a misrepresentation of saying that they all go through. I don't know anybody that grows cannabis illegally. I don't know anybody who deals crack, heroin, cocaine. Oh, to my knowledge, I don't know anybody that does any of that. I think it is disingenuous and it is disheartening to people keep referring to that cannabis is a soft, fluffy, there's a drug, there's nobody getting harmed, there's no one who can be endangered by this in any way. We still have people, yes, with medicinal cannabis driving. We have that discussed in our report from the Select Committee about the issues around people in medicinal cannabis and driving. But we also have people who are driving high as a kite, completely stoned from smoking. So it's not the fluffy drug that people think it is. It's not the cure. It's not the end all. It's just, I think we have to be very, very careful and really think deep and hard before we carry on with this thing. Thank you.
Members, the question is the bill be read a second time. The Honourable Brad Pettit.
Thank you, President. I'm pleased to stand up and speak in support of this bill, and I thank the Honourable Dr. Brian Walker for bringing this on, and his colleague, the Honourable Dr. Sophia Marmont, because this bill, I think, is beautiful in its simplicity. It could be the shortest amendment bill, and look, what it does is something that is so deeply sensible and logical, which I think it's very hard to argue against. And hearing some of the commentary before, I just come back. You literally could read the bill several times, the amendments, I should say, and several times in the time that I've got, but it's quite simple. It is just simply saying that the court is not required to declare a person to be a drug trafficker if the court is satisfied that it would be clearly unjust to do so. This is not a radical amendment. This is merely it's extremely straightforward and sensible, and the court must be required to give its decisions to do so. I struggle to understand really what the argument could be against such a sensible and clear an amendment. I think would certainly take out what I think has been quite clearly identified as some of the unjust natures of the that the misuse of drugs bill currently works. And so it's a really good logical step in the right direction. One which you would, I think if there was ever a simple amendment that should get up in this place, that comes from the crossbench, I think this should be right up there, because it's one that could be done very simply and very easily. Now, there's been obviously the broader debate, and the Honourable Lorna Harper kind of touched on it, around nature of drugs and cannabis as part of that. Again, I would just say in response to some of that, what's quite clear around this is that it's about giving the courts the discretion to actually make that judgment. Something that I think is actually extremely sensible to do, and one where when we don't give that discretion, and we do have a whole range of unjust consequences coming as a result of that. I think that doesn't help in any way. So, well done, really sensible. I would also just like to use, I think this, obviously, there's no doubt the bill's so short, it'd be impossible to use an hour to talk on it. But I do think it does, and the Honourable Lorna Harper went down this path a little bit as well, around saying, well, what does this mean for how we think about drugs, and in particular cannabis in particular? And And I just want to reflect on it. So, I mean, I am having my two colleagues here on the crossbench who have had a really strong focus on cannabis, and means that even though my party, the Greens, shares those views, I haven't had to focus on that because it's been very competently dealt with in this place by my two colleagues. But in the last, we recently had the Greens National Conference here in Perth, and David Shoebridge, Senator for New South Wales, who has the carriage of this portfolio at a national level, came over, and it was the first time I'd had a chance to really actually sit down and see what was happening nationally in this space. And I think it's interesting to see what is happening, because it supports very much what legalised cannabis have been doing here in terms of their work and the Greens' position as well. They did quite a big survey around actually the legalisation of cannabis nationally. And what was fascinating is when that bill, they've got a bill which is actually called Legalising Cannabis Bill, surprisingly enough, 2023, which is introduced to the Senate in August. When that bill was proposed and was advertised, what I thought was really interesting is that they had almost 9,000 submissions to that bill, which I think is pretty. And I think it kind of shows the passion and the interest in this topic, not just here in WA, but also across the country. Now, not only were there almost 9,000 submissions, but 92.3% of those submissions were in favour, which is pretty extraordinary. So, what this bill is doing, something which is I think is certainly related to the Misuse of Drugs amendment that's before us, actually tries to create a national framework for how you would legalise and ultimately regulate cannabis activities. And create actually a Cannabis Australia National Agency. Interesting actually to actually acknowledge, a bit like alcohol, that this is a drug that we need to stop treating as a criminal drug, but actually just treat it as something that actually is something that is very much part of our society. In fact, frankly, is less damaging in most cases than alcohol. And actually, how do we then actually make it part of our economy? And interestingly, one of the things that stuck in my head was that there was a $28 billion return to coffers over the coming decade if such a bill was passed. I mean, so it's actually a huge opportunity to actually how we do this, rather than continually trying to treat it as something that's criminal and basically pushed into a black market, which everybody is a loser. So I want to commend this bill. I think this is a very modest amendment that is proposed, one that I struggle to see what the argument could possibly be against it. But in doing so, I want to acknowledge, of course, there is a whole bunch more work, which I know Legalised Cannabis are working on, which the Greens are working on nationally as well, to actually say, actually, this is an opportunity to move on. Legalising cannabis is coming. And even if we can't persuade our colleagues in government here, hopefully we will see some changes at a national level that will speed up this process. Thank you.
Members, the question is the bill be read a second time. The Honourable Stephen Pratt had actually sought the call.
Thank you, President.
Before.
Look, I'd like to continue on where the Honourable Brad Pettit just left off in terms of the body of work that is associated with this issue. And it is a really, really serious issue. There is a lot of interest, as was outlined in the submissions that were made to the other bill that the Legalised Cannabis Party have been developing. And I thank you for the opportunity to be able to speak on this topic. I'm not sure that I've had the chance to speak about cannabis and the use of it to date in my tenure in this place. And I'll take the opportunity to speak about a whole range of things to do with cannabis and the intent of the amendment bill. Without identifying anyone, I do want to let the House know that I have a personal experience with this, and I have seen firsthand the damage that use and abuse of cannabis can have on someone's life. And although that obviously impacts me emotionally, it doesn't shape necessarily how I feel about how we should legislate in this place. And I don't want you to take this as some signal that I'm hardline no on any avenue towards, or the pathway towards a different approach to these things. But I have seen the damage that it can have and the long-lasting impact that it can have on individuals and their families. So on that note, I wanted to talk about the initiatives that the government invests in through the Mental Health Commission and through programs in our schools, and ones that I'm aware of, such as the Drug Aware program. I don't know if it's still called SEDERA. There used to be the School Drug Education something. I don't know what the rest of the acronym stands for anymore. But these are really important initiatives because it goes to that early intervention and prevention, which I think is very important when we talk about the use of cannabis, for instance, because I note on a number of occasions the Honourable Brian Walker has taken every opportunity to speak about cannabis, as he should, and as the Honourable Sophia Mormont should in their capacity as members of the Legalised Cannabis Party. But I do note that, I'll paraphrase a bit, I might nail it, but we'll see. The Honourable Dr Brian Walker has referred to cannabis as a healthy healing herb. And I'm not sure that last bit that you provided with the interjection is always used. I have read parts of the missing budget paper, and I know that it's used in your foreword in that document, and I think that part is key. It can be abused, and I think we're not quite there in terms of the level of sophistication and maturity in the community in terms of how this drug can be used. And I know it's purported to be harmless in the language that you use, and that's a great bit of marketing spin, a healthy healing herb. And I think we've discovered that it can be when used for medicinal purposes, and when it's done in a regulated manner, and it's got the nasties taken out of it so that it can actually assist members. And hey, I'm not a doctor, so I'm just having a go at this. I think you can interject. I'm not sure, because the Honourable...
all interjections, Honourable Member, are considered unruly, particularly inviting interjections. The Honourable Stephen Pratt.
Okay, I'll start speaking through the chair, through the President, sorry. So I haven't even got to the main part of my speech yet, but I did want to refer to that document, the missing budget paper, because it presents the strong economic argument, okay? And I think that has value, and I think that tells one side of the story. But the body of work in terms of bringing the community along, displaying that there's community support for legalising it, I think there's still more to be done in that space. And this amendment, whilst you may agree or disagree with it, I have my own personal concern in terms of approaching the changes to legislation in terms of cannabis in a piecemeal approach. And I think that the government, I'm aware that the government is undertaking a large body of work in this space. One example I know that has been raised, the concerns around people being charged when driving and being found under the influence, and then having they're on a prescription for medicinal cannabis. And I know that there's work being done on that. But I do also want to speak about the impact on society, the negative impacts that do happen, and it comes back to this level of sophistication. And with cannabis, it can be taken in a myriad of ways. It can be consumed and put into foods. it can be smoked in a range of different ways. And I think depending on how that is done and whether that's being combined with other drugs as well, is where the harm comes into play and the use and abuse comes into play. When I talk about that, I'm referring to whether you're having a joint, whether you're using some sort of bong, or is that the right terminology? Someone else can scientific term. But I think as you grow old year by year, your perspective on this stuff does change. I remember in school it was probably considered to be a cool thing to be associating with those things. But now that I'm almost 40, yeah, I know, and I've got young kids, your perspective does change, and you do start to think about how you can prevent this happening or having some impact on their upbringing, because it's in those early formative years where the damage is done. And it's also probably where the prevalence of use and misuse is higher, because you think you're invincible when you're a teenager and you'll want to try a whole range of different things and take risks, and this is where the damage can be done and it can impact on the rest of your life. So given the significant work that is ongoing in this space, I think it's probably a bit early to determine if this amendment is the best way forward or to proceed. So I'll leave it at that in terms of that aspect. But I did want to talk on a whole range of issues associated that associate with this amendment and the use of cannabis. I've already referred to the healthy herb, healing herb quote, and the fact that it can be abused, and that is the key part of that quote that I think needs to be highlighted. And I've also referred to the report, the missing budget paper, which highlights the economic benefit. It also has a nice infographic at the start which shows the ways that it can be consumed, the regularity of consumption, and I think it does paint that picture about the level of sophistication in terms of methods used, regularity of use, and whether people that haven't probably submitted to that data set would be honest or dishonest about how often they're using as well. And I think I've said already, the economic argument creates a lot of interest, and we're certainly not going to be the first jurisdiction to go down that path if it does happen. And I think there's advantages in looking what's happened overseas and in other jurisdictions to see the impacts, both positive and negative. I think I'm not sure. I think there's still work to be done in bringing the community along to a point where there'd be comfort in that, to be honest, even though I shouldn't be inviting interjections, sorry. I spoke about the different consumption methods, and I think that's an interesting point, because with other drugs, you know, there's usually one or two ways you can introduce that into your system, and away you go. But with this, the impact is different. I think if you put it in food, or it can do different things. If you smoke it, it can do another thing. And I know that in the jurisdictions where it's been legalised, they're selling gummies and things like that. And I'm not sure how it gets to that point, but I do have concerns about whether my kids could get their hands on that somehow if it wasn't handled properly by the person who'd purchased it. Or on, like we've recently had Halloween, if someone did something silly and decided to give it out, I think there's some danger in that area, but I'm no expert. So I mentioned I have seen the firsthand the damage that it can do to people, and deal with that on an ongoing basis. And despite my anecdotal evidence, there is also a large body of evidence on the significant physical and mental health harms that can be related to cannabis, and it comes back to this use versus abuse argument or discussion more than an argument. And also the other health impacts in terms of, that we know about in terms of respiratory illnesses associated with smoking generally, and I'm sure that that extends to cannabis use if that's something you do on a regular basis. I will come back to the member's second reading speech, and I just wanted to refer to a couple of items in there. And the Honourable Sophia Mormond also mentioned this as well, and it's the issue surrounding what I would refer to as self-medicating. And I have concerns with it because people are finding themselves in the courts because of this, and I have concerns about that because they're obviously in a desperate situation and they're trying to do whatever they can to manage the ailments that they are suffering. But I also have concerns that this might be happening without seeking the appropriate medical interventions first. I am aware, in terms of the Honourable Lorna Harper's contribution, that we're still working on different ways that we can provide medicinal cannabis to people. I think there's really still a cost impediment to people. I know of people that have children with epilepsy who have, I think it is on the PBS now, I'm not certain of that, but I know originally the cost associated with the monthly prescription was in the thousands, and people have had to mortgage houses and stuff to care for their loved ones, and in this circumstance it's with a child, and you'll do whatever it takes to make sure that they're cared for, and if this is the treatment that works, then you're going to pursue it. But that cost impediment has also led to people going down the growing their own and trying to create their own, and I am aware of stories of people being charged with that, and I think it is an issue that needs further investigation. The only other point in the second reading speech that I wanted to touch on was the issue around there was cases where people have been charged with or labelled as a drug trafficker, despite the fact that no profit was being made, no money was changing hands, but they were yet a drug trafficker declaration was given to these people. And I think I get the point that is trying to be made there, but I still don't think that it makes it okay at the end of the day, because someone could be growing it and distributing it free of charge. I don't know. So they could be getting some other in-kind benefit from going down that path as well. If you just give me a moment to find my point. So I guess I really do want to highlight that there's more work that needs to be done in this space, and given this has been brought on by members of the Legalised Cannabis Party, I think it does go some way to keeping this front of mind, because we're debating or discussing these issues in the chamber today. But I think that there's still this body of work, and the onus is somewhat on your party, but also on government if it decides to go down this path, to make sure that there's community support. I think that missing budget paper does have a stat, I don't have it with me, but it does have a stat around support. But I couldn't see where that had been sourced from or how that number had been brought on. So I think further work in terms of evidencing community support, and I still don't know how we necessarily combat those challenges around how people are using it and how it doesn't then fall into the abuse category. And I think there's more work that needs to be done in that space. And you could refer to alcohol and its legalisation. It still doesn't stop people abusing it. So there's probably more work to be done in that space. I have said on previous occasions that I do really appreciate the contributions made in this place by members from the Legalised Cannabis Party, both members in this place. And I think we all understand that you have been elected to this chamber to pursue these issues relating to the legalisation of cannabis. And I assume this is one attempt to head towards that path, but I do have some concerns around whether this is the right approach in terms of a small amendment to a piece of legislation, or whether that would potentially fit into a larger scheme of amendments or changes down the track. And I don't know, because I haven't had a briefing on the amendment, whether it could have other impacts on other pieces of legislation or anything like that. Efforts have been made by this government, especially in terms of medicinal cannabis, and there's a really positive story to tell in terms of how this government has approached this. I think in opposition, Mark McGowan made a commitment around legalising medicinal cannabis, and that goes back to, I think, 2014. 3 years later, we found ourselves in government, and we made those changes. And I think as soon as those changes were made, we were confronted with these issues around cost prohibition for people, and how difficult it was to source the actual medicinal cannabis into WA. So then a body of work was done to make sure that we had better access. And I think the Liberal opposition at the time initially opposed moves to legalise medicinal cannabis, and within months realised that they were on the wrong side and changed their view on things. So you can change members' opinions on these things. I did start by speaking about prevention, and I think this is an area of focus where the government does play a significant role. Through those school programs, Drug Aware is one that I noted, and I'm also aware of in-community services such as residential rehab services that are funded through the Mental Health Commission, and the number of beds associated with those services have grown under this government, and they play a significant role in managing how people can, who have been impacted in a negative way or have found that they do have issues around use and abuse of these substances, that they can go into these programs and hopefully come out the other side as a better member of society and free of any addiction issues or reliance on the use of cannabis or other drugs. So I think, let me just check if I've covered everything. I did touch on, it was 2014 when we committed to doing that. And I think with that, I just want to make sure I haven't missed anything else I wanted to touch. So the last thing that I wanted to mention, because I don't want it to be missed in all of this, is that the government is doing things in this space. So the members would be aware that we've provided the diversion options, such as the Cannabis Intervention Requirement Scheme. And I think this plays a significant role, or assists people in some way that do find themselves in front of the courts with a cannabis offence, and diverts them away from going to prison or something like that and into a program where they can get some education around whether that's the best thing for them to be associating themselves with. I've touched on the residential rehab therapeutic communities for AOD. We have them in the southwest and metro areas. We've opened the Midland Withdrawal and Intervention Centre, and we provide those education services in schools. So I think there's a larger body of work that needs to be done on this journey. Although I have had a personal negative experience with someone close to me, I'm still open to learning more about this and seeing where the community stands on this, and I think there's still a way to go. And I'll let someone else have a go. Thank you.
The Honourable Wilson Tucker.
Acting President, I rise today in support of this motion and of the Misuse of Drugs Amendment Bill. Now, I appreciate there are members in this chamber who are certainly more knowledgeable on the subject of cannabis than myself, and certainly the members from the Cannabis and Hemp Party have, if I can use the term, probably more hands-on experience on the topic of cannabis than myself. We heard some comments from the Honourable Lorna Harper, who shared her views and some personal experience with cannabis, as did the Honourable Stephen Pratt. Now, I'm not here to argue against those personal experiences or views. I can only really just share my own. Members will be aware I lived in Seattle, Washington for close to 5 years, where there is a thriving recreational industry for cannabis. And it was my experience, it was actually a less harmful alternative than alcohol. And that was also shared by a lot of my friends. And I understand this isn't the experience or the views of a lot of people, but certainly for a large cohort of people living in Washington, we heard about gummies, taking a gummy on a Friday night as a way to relax, as opposed to drinking, 5 beers, 10 beers, whatever it may be. Sure.
Do that instead of drinking, like didn't drink.
Well, that absolutely. Typically, that is the case. Sure, there's people in the community who would probably take both, and I wouldn't recommend it. But my experience was just taking it as a sort of standalone drug in replacement of alcohol, and you actually feel much better. Well, you sleep much better, and you certainly wake up feeling much more refreshed. Now, I understand this misuse of drugs bill isn't focused on the legalisation of cannabis in WA or trying to really set up a recreational industry for cannabis in WA, God forbid. It's trying to make some sensible updates to the Misuse of Drugs Act in terms of the threshold for a drug trafficking offence. Now, foreshadowing the vote, which I'm sure won't be successful, I would like to take this opportunity and acknowledge the Cannabis Party's advocacy in this space. I understand it's been a couple of years of trying to bring this bill through the process and hopefully get to a vote. We know that private members' time is very rare and fleeting, and so there aren't many opportunities to use that time to advance your cause or indeed a bill. So I appreciate the Cannabis Party's commitment to actually getting to a vote and to a decision on this bill. And despite the fact that it's unlikely to be successful, I still think there is value and power in getting to a decision. And it is my decision today to support this motion and to support this bill.
The Honourable Dan Caddy.
Thank you, Acting President. And thank you to all the other members that have spoken. You certainly learn a lot from listening to them. And the Honourable Lorna Harper has clearly benefited from her time on the Select Committee into cannabis and hemp. Indeed, I myself learned a lot from listening to her talk about her experiences on that committee. And I know she said at one point she felt like she was back in Scotland. Well, with a motion that's come from Dr. Brian Walker and with the Honourable Lorna Harper as the third speaker, I think all of us in this chamber felt a little bit like we might be back in Scotland as well. I have no first-hand experience to go or to draw on when it comes to cannabis, but I do have, as does the Honourable Stephen Pratt, I do have second-hand experience, and it was a long, long time ago. In fact, I was in my early years of adulthood, and it was an experience that saw one of my friends go from enjoying himself to being in the back of an ambulance in a matter of minutes. And so it has really coloured my view of cannabis for the rest of my life, which often happens. It was, to me at the time, a pretty traumatic experience to see him leaving. And also, for some reason, I'm not sure who travelled in the ambulance with him, but it wasn't me. And I remember that too, because I thought that I remember at the time thinking I really wanted to go with him. But that's another story. The Honourable Dr. Brad Pettit said it's a short bill. It is. It's a really short bill. But just because the bill is short or the amendment is short doesn't mean it cannot have massive impacts. And I think that's the critical thing we need to look at. So I want to look at the second reading speech of the Honourable Dr. Brian Walker. And then briefly look at the explanatory memorandum, which itself is short as well, given it's a short bill. And then I want to talk about or put on the record, I guess, the current law here in Western Australia with respect to cannabis related driver impairment and the testing, because it's important in the course of this debate to at least put that on the record there. People can look it up, but if you put it on the record in the course of Hansard, then it's there. And I also may, time permitting, and I know time is tight, talk a little to the report that was published by the Select Committee into cannabis and hemp. In fact, I might shoot first to the explanatory memorandum, because there was just a one point in this, and this should be quite quick. And under the third heading, Misuse of Drugs Amendment Bill, it says the amendment tackles any suggestion of injustice, arbitrariness or unfairness within the Misuse of Drugs Act 1881. Unfairness is a really subjective word, I think. Unfairness is very much a matter of opinion, and as I've talked about, and as did the Honourable Stephen Pratt, people who have seen either emergency situations due to cannabis, or have seen lives ruined due to cannabis, and I've seen lives ruined due to other drugs. But fortunately enough for me, not cannabis. I think the question of unfairness is absolutely subjective. It's an absolutely subjective term, and I just think it's important to state that, because if we look at this, and that is where our starting point, where we are saying these laws are unfair, that's a premise that regardless of where I land on this, and I think it's a bit too early to determine where I'll land on this, but that's a premise that I can't accept, that we're starting from a premise of an unfair law. But I'll just go very quickly to, and I have the Hansard here of the second reading speech, the Honourable Dr. Brian Walker, a good and concise speech. But there's a few points I wanted to pick up, because we can't always take everything that is uttered in this place as uncontested. The first line, it came as some surprise to me. The Misuse of Drugs Act had been enforced for so long without a major rewrite. I'll talk about that in a minute. the Pareto principle that you talked about. That's interesting, and I want to unpack that a little bit because I think while it may appear to be going down a rabbit hole, it's an important one, and then looking at what it means in practice. I think it's important to note when it's stated in this place that the Misuse of Drugs Act 1981 has been enforced without a major rewrite. That may well be the case, but there's a lot of legislation that is systematically updated, if you like, through the use of amendments. And a quick look at just the last 20 years of a law that's been in place now for over 40 years, we've seen 12 amendment bills put to this law. That's an average of more than 2 for every cycle of Parliament. Sometimes incrementalism is preferable to a total rewrite, not always. But the fact that this is a law that has constantly been reviewed, and many of them are just Misuse of Drugs Amendment Bill 2023, obviously, which is in the other place, 2021, which is yours, the Misuse of Drugs Amendment Bill 2018, the Misuse of Drugs Amendment Bill 2011, the Misuse of Drugs Amendment Bill 2010, the Misuse of Drugs Amendment Bill 2006, the Misuse of Drugs Amendment Bill 2003, the Misuse of Drugs Amendment Bill number 2, 2010, the Misuse of Drugs Amendment Bill Search Powers Bill 2016, and the Misuse of Drugs Amendment Methamphetamine Offences Bill 2017, and the Misuse of Drugs Methamphetamine Amendment Bill 2007. So there have been many amendments. I can't speak to all of them. I don't know that have been put, amendment bills that have been put. I can't speak to all of them. I don't know off the top of my head what they were all about, but I can see that there's at least 3 of them that are in relation to drugs, not necessarily cannabis, but there has been an incremental updating and a continual looking at this bill. So to say that there hasn't been a major, I want to get the words right, a major rewrite, although that may be true, there hasn't been a major rewrite. There has been a lot of focus on this bill, and a lot of that focus has been in the last 20 years. As I said, when you go through that list there, that's more than two bills that have been put to Parliament for each cycle, on average, for each cycle of government. I wanted to get to the second bit because this is interesting. Bearing in mind, and I quote from the Hansard here, bearing in mind the Pareto principle is the most effect that can be achieved with the least input. It's an interesting one because to me the Pareto principle is very much in inverted commas, causal law, I guess you would call it. And I know this is potentially not pertinent to the bill, but it has been used as a basis for saying this is a change, and it's a rabbit hole worth going down because the Pareto principle is more commonly known as the 80-20 principle, and it's found in nature. People will tell you 80% of fruit comes from 20% of the tree. It's found in sport. 80% of the score comes from 20% of your players. It's a principle that's found, it's often quoted in business, and I guess it depends on the business. 80% of your business comes from 20% of your clients. But in every one of these cases, that does not mean that the other 80% of the tree or the team or your business contacts are not important. In fact, and in many cases are not critical. You need to tend to the entire tree, or you will not get the fruit. And AFL, it may well be, I use AFL as a sport, it could be any sport, it may well be the forwards that kick all the goals, but without the backs and the mids, they're not going to get the ball to kick the goals. So the rest of the team is critically important. And in business as well, I mean, I remember when I had my business and I got to that happy stage where you look at your client list and your client list is full. So you get to start cutting clients, and that's for anyone who's grown their own business, that's a happy day, because you look at the clients you're going to cut, and they absolutely Honourable Dr. Brian Walker, they come from that 80% that only gives you 20% of the income. But it's not that simple. You don't just start cutting off. You don't just start cutting off the bottom. One would be unwise to do so in business. Some clients may spend little, but they may have contacts and bring in other clients that become big, important spenders in your business, and some are simply good clients to have on your website when you're looking for touting for other business. Some are clients that may be small and may spend little, but it's one phone call a year, and there you go. So I don't think this is a good principle on which to say we should legislate. I think that there needs to be a deeper look at that. And I mean, if we go, I've got a report here. I'll just be really brief, if I can find it, an NCS report on here it is, motor vehicle safety issues. And admittedly, this is interesting because we are talking with this bill. We are going to talking about driver impairment, and this is a report that was done on speeding, which is another issue. But it's North American, but it says that in dry conditions, of all the crashes, only 18%. In only 18% of them was speed a factor. And so that means, by definition, 82% of crashes were caused by factors that weren't speed. Therefore, using the logic that we're saying here, we would be legislating that in dry conditions there are no speed limits. And that simply does not follow. I know, as many people who have travelled to or lived in Europe, as have I know that in Europe speed conditions change depending on weather conditions, and they're fairly advanced with their digital signs. I can tell you, even when I was living in Belgium in 1991 on the French highways, not all the speed signs, but a lot of the speed signs were weather dependent. But you would never say that simply because it was only 18%, we shouldn't have speed limits on there. And now I really wanted to take a look and just put on the record, as I said I would, and I may well run out of time, the current situation. I just want to be clear about what the current situation is with respect to what I loosely term drug driving in Western Australia. And before I start talking about the role of the police, I just want to say what an outstanding job our police officers do in Western Australia, right across this state. Every officer, from Commissioner Blanche right down to the latest recruits and graduates. The report, I'll just quickly read from the report, just the opening line. So this is for Hansard, this is the Select Committee into Cannabis and Hemp, Medicinal Cannabis and Industrial Hemp in Western Australia report. And the opening line under the drug driving laws, which can be found at 8.23. In WA, it's an offence for a person to drive or attempt to drive a motor vehicle while a prescribed illicit drug, those three words are in quotes, is present in the person's oral fluid or blood. The Road Traffic Act Drug Driving Regulations 2007 declares each of the following drugs to be a prescribed illicit drug: TCH, methamphetamine and MDMA. TCH obviously being the one that is pertinent to what we are talking about today. And THC, sorry, my apologies, yeah. And I'm even reading it, but I appreciate the interjection. Thank you, Honourable Dr. Brian Walker. It also says a person commits an offence if they drive or attempt to drive a motor vehicle while under the influence of drugs to such an extent as to be incapable of having proper control of the vehicle. So it's under section 64AC. That's an offence to drive a motor vehicle while a prescribed illicit drug is present in oral fluid or blood. And the drugs that are prescribed illicit drugs, as I said, THC, got it right, methamphetamine and MDMA. The offence does not have an element of being under the influence or being impaired. It simply relies on the presence of such substances, which I think gets to the core of what you're talking about. The scientific evidence is clear that consumption of cannabis or cannabis-derived products containing the psychoaddictive compound THC, whether consumed lawfully or unlawfully, can affect a person's ability to safely drive a vehicle. It's also clear that a high proportion of recreational cannabis users are young people who, sadly, are already very overrepresented in road crashes and road trauma statistics. Community attitude surveys conducted for the Road Safety Commission show that a fear of getting caught is a powerful influence on driver behaviour, and that random roadside alcohol and drug testing is and has been very effective as a general deterrence. Any suggested reforms, obviously, as the Honourable Stephen Pratt said, need to be carefully considered based on solid scientific evidence, the best evidence we have and the most recent evidence we have to hand, and done in a manner that does not compromise any road safety outcomes. Members in this place would be familiar with alcohol testing. I'd be surprised if any of us haven't been random breath tested many times. But unlike alcohol testing, our current roadside testing ability is unable to determine the level of impairment due to TCH, nor is it able to distinguish between TCH that has been consumed for medicinal reasons or indeed as recreational use. The Road Safety Commission is monitoring developments in both cannabis testing technologies and related drug driving laws across Australia and overseas, but has advised that until tests are available that measure cannabis impairment accurately, these tests can be widely and these tests can be widely and cost-effectively deployed at the roadside. The safest course from a road safety perspective is to retain the current system. And just looking at specifically at roadside drug testing for THC, I keep saying TCH. This is a problem, Dr. Walker. And as I said, we've all been tested, I'm sure, for alcohol testing. I had just to share a quick story, an incredible experience. I was driving down York Street, for those of you who know Albany, and thankfully at the time I was in a Land Cruiser because I was pulled over by a police officer on a horse. And she told me to wind down the window and inform me that it was a random breath test. And she had to very much lean down. She was very accommodating. She allowed the passenger in my car to take a photo of it. It was quite funny. But she had to lean down from her horse into the Land Cruiser to test me. I don't know. Yeah, I don't know what she would have done, Honourable Minister, if I'd been driving a Ferrari, because that would have been a sight to see. But I've never been so lucky to have driven a Ferrari. I've never been so lucky to have driven a Ferrari. But that was I'll never forget that. I've been random breath tested many times, but that one absolutely sticks in my memory from many years ago. So under 64AC, it's an offence to drive a motor vehicle while a prescribed illicit drug is present, and we've been down that path. There are also other offences under the RTA, Road Traffic Act that is, that deal with driving whilst under the influence of drugs, Section 63(1)B, and driving whilst impaired by drugs, Section 64AB. The definition of drug used in those sections is A drug to which the Misuse of Drugs Act 1981 applies, or a Schedule 4 poison, as defined in the Medicines and Poisons Act 2014, Section 3, or a substance other than alcohol that, when consumed or used by a person, deprives the person, either temporarily or permanently, of any of that person's normal mental or physical faculties. Also, both of those sections have a defence available to the accused, and that defence is found at Section 63(1)B, and it is, in any proceedings for an offence against subsection 1B, it is a defence for the accused to prove that the drugs under the influence of which the accused is alleged or appears on the evidence to be were taken by him pursuant to a prescription of a medical practitioner, nurse practitioner or dentist, or administered to him by a medical practitioner, nurse practitioner or dentist for therapeutic purposes, and 2, that he was not aware, says he, should say he or she, they, was not aware and could not reasonably have been expected to be aware that those drugs were likely to render him incapable of having proper control of a motor vehicle. And there is also a defence available, Acting President, for section 64AB. In any proceeding, and it is in any proceeding for an offence against this section, it is a defence for the accused to prove in respect of the drug or each drug, referred to in subsection 5, that A, the drug was, point 1, taken pursuant to a prescription of a medical practitioner, nurse practitioner or dentist, or 2, administered by a medical practitioner, nurse practitioner or dentist for therapeutic purposes, and B, that where the drug was received or obtained by the accused in a package form, the packaging of the drug did not indicate a label advising that the drug was likely to result in a condition that would be inconsistent with the person being capable of having proper control of a motor vehicle. And
Members,